So it's a great pleasure for me to announce our keynote speaker for today. So we have Chad Bown as a keynote speaker. He was introduced this morning as one of the fathers of the non-tariff measures databases, and that is actually true, because later on I will summarize a little bit about the day, and I will then say also a little bit how the NTM work came about. And I will talk about 4 phases, and I'm not going to say this now because you should stay until the end of this the day today. But you were instrumental for phase 3, so I jumped directly, because then we jumped from a coverage which was really scattered, like a few countries here and there, maybe coverage of 50% of world trade or so. We jumped then with the kind of what we call the top 25 traders project into the coverage of 90% of world trade, having all the big fish in the database. So you did a great contribution to the non-tariff measures work. You probably don't need an introduction. We all know him. He was your colleague before. He worked in the World Bank, and we all know him from the trade talks, of course, that he currently does. He is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Prior to that, he was a lead economist at the World Bank. And before that, he was professor at the Brandeis University. So, Chad, please give us your keynote.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to do a couple of things. First is I turned 50 this year, which means you need to get glasses to actually read stuff now. So I have to put my glasses on so I can actually read what I'm going to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about today some new research that I've begun to look into that sort of fits the broader theme of what you all are covering in the workshop today. But before I did that, I wanted to talk a little bit about, so think about what I'll say. Give me 30, 35 minutes, but it'll be very informal. If you want to take a nap during this period, go ahead too. You won't miss anything. But I want to break it up as follows. Maybe the first 15 minutes or so, talk a little bit about how I see this overall project, my role in it. Ralph described it partially. I want to tell a slightly different story. And then in the end, I'll come back to this. But to do this, I think it's important to put my weekend into context for all of you. So I have 17-year-old daughters. They're twins. And they just graduated from high school this weekend. So that means they were born in August of 2005. So I'm going to tell a long history and just have it in your mind 2005 for that reason. But why I'm bringing this up is I had to sit through a lot of graduation speeches over the past weekend, talking about, anyway, so I'm thinking of a little bit of today. This is like a graduation speech to sort of provide a little bit of history, to pat you all on the back for what it is that you're doing, the important work that you're doing, and to try to step back a little bit, talk about how this fits in. And it's not going to be that inspirational, I apologize, but this is such an important area that you all are working in and on. And in many respects, it's going to continue to be important as we're seeing in what I'm going to talk about when I get to the research. Even for rich countries today, the stuff comes back. So if you like NTMs, that's great. You're going to spend the rest of your career, even when your kids graduate from high school, working on these things too. Okay, so again, thanks to Key. She gave me a little bit more notice than 6:30 this morning to tell me that I was going to do this. She asked me a year ago if I would do this. So I got a little bit more notice than all of you. Ralph, it's wonderful to see you as well. Key completely oversold my role in this whole project. I will put it into context what it is that I'll explain exactly what it is. I wish I had played a bigger role in many respects and deserve credit for what's happened here, but I really should not. Okay, so I'm Chad, Trade Talks, but once upon a time, the first time I came to the bank, I think, was in 1994. I was just finished college. I had an internship at USAID here in Washington, D.C., and there was a conference here at the World Bank on agricultural stuff, and I remember meeting Will Martin. How many of you know who Will Martin is? Okay, cool. I'm going to throw out a lot of names today of very famous trade economist types of people like that. But that was my sort of first exposure to the bank, even before I went to graduate school. I went immediately from undergrad to a PhD program at Wisconsin in economics and did my graduate work with Bob Stager, right? So trade policy, institutions, that's all I do. My first job, and I finished in 1999. My first job was at Brandeis, so an assistant professor starting at Brandeis in 1999. In 2004, so the year that I was going up for tenure from Brandeis, it turns out it's not a bad idea to get out of town when your senior colleagues are considering whether to give you tenure or not. So I came to Washington. They did give me tenure, and it was great. I had a lovely career at Brandeis, loved the environment and all my colleagues there. But it was nice to not be in my department for that year. And so I came down here because I had a fellowship at the Brookings Institution. That was an academic year fellowship from September to the following June. And at that point in time, I had met a couple of people from the bank. Chalar Ozden. Is Chalar still in his deck, but I don't know, what do you call it? Is it? Yeah, he's very fancy now. Back then he wasn't that fancy, but he was great. And I met him at, I don't know, the Midwest International Economics Group meeting, something like that, at a conference, and we got it talking. And he introduced me to Bernard Hoekman, who was the director or the manager of the research unit in trade in DEC at the time. And he would subsequently go on to become the director of the trade, I don't know what you call it, the competitiveness, whatever, at the time, the real world folks working on trade. So in any case, I'd met Chalar and Bernard, and we'd written a paper together on an NTM, anti-dumping. I haven't seen any papers about anti-dumping here today so far, but maybe we'll get there. And at this point in time, what had happened in research on anti-dumping is there was this guy at Oregon, Bruce Blonigan. Is anybody here a Bruce Blonigan student? Okay, presumably people know who Bruce is. He's amazing, great. He had gotten a National Science Foundation grant in probably the late 2000s to do empirical work on anti-dumping for the United States. And this was, remember, early days of the internet. And as part of his NSF grant, he had made his database public. Right, and it was, an Excel spreadsheets essentially of all the U.S. anti-dumping activity over history, kind of the first NTM database in some sense. I think UNCTAD had put out maybe an early version of trains or something at that point in time, but this was fantastic. So summer of 2004, I wanted to come down and spend a full year here in Washington, and I knew Chalar and I knew Bernard, and said, my fellowship starts at Brookings in September. Can I just come and kind of hang out with your group for a couple months during the summer, get here a little bit early, spend July and August in the group? And they said, sure. So people here today that do trade and that are in the bank, you're all amazing. Absolutely amazing. This is not to disparage anything, but this was kind of peak trade in the World Bank. So let me read out the names of people that were here at this point in time. So I already mentioned Will Martin. So Alan Winters, I think, was the director. So this was 2000, summer of 2004. Alan Winters, I think, was director of research, sort of Dion's job at that time. Chalar, Key was already here by then. Anna, what's that? Aditya, Alessandro, you were still here then, right? You might have been just like sort of close on your way out, but you were still here. I think I met you at that moment in time. Marcelo Oloriega. Kim Anderson was, I think, spending a 2-year stint here, the famous, ag economist in Australia, done stuff on wine. Caroline Freund was still here. Karsten Fink, now the chief economist at WIPO, he was here with other visitors in town. Kishore Gawande was in during that era. Kamal Saji was here. Nuno Lamau. Anyway, this was just Beata Javorczyk was still here at that point. It was just an amazing group of trade people interested in sort of policy and all that kind of stuff. Even at the fund at that era, across the street, they had a trade unit. Remember this? And it was Shangjin Wei, Arvind Subramanian, Mary Amidi they had in for a year at that point in time. So this was just an incredible It was just an incredibly amazing time to be in these institutions and to have trade be a part of it. So I spent the summer here, and I was doing already some work on, I did a lot of empirical work on WTO disputes, and was starting to do some work on anti-dumping, a non-tariff measure. And had noticed what Bruce Bonnigan had done to put out this stuff for the United States, and had noticed by this point in time that it wasn't just the United States, but this is a trade policy that was really, really beginning to be used by a lot of developing countries, emerging economies, the like. So I went to Bernard and said, hey, Bruce Bonnigan has done this amazing public good, provided this database on what's been happening in the United States. Somebody should really put together this data set on what's, how anti-dumping is being used, across the developing world, since this seems to be a really, really important thing, right? And he said, I agree with you, Chad, you should do it. And I don't know why I did, but I agreed to do it, right? So this was actually relatively cheap. I think over the course of the next year, Bernard maybe found $15,000 or something like that. This was not a large amount of money. And we managed, so this was basically I just tapped into my graduate students at Brandeis at this point in time, who had, at this point, governments were still reporting a lot of their stuff, and as you've noticed and had to deal with in the context of this project, only reporting things in their own language, right? So you've got to find experts that can read through legislation, or in this case here, these announcements of investigations, measures imposed, HS codes, things like that, but in various languages, Spanish, Portuguese, Turkish, Korean, Chinese, depending on the country that you have involved. So I was able to tap into the students that I had at Brandeis to help me put together this database. And we did that, within a year. And we put it together for maybe 15 countries or something like that. But it was primarily initially just for academics to kind of use as a research tool. And this is 2005. October 2005 is when we put out the first version. Fast forward 3 years, right, 2008, and now we've got the financial crisis. And we have the Great Trade Collapse, right? And at this point in time, it's not like today. We had no idea why trade collapsed in the third, fourth quarter of 2008, fourth quarter of 2009. We didn't have up-to-date data on trade policy. And so Bernard calls me, and I'm back at Brandeis at this point in time. I have twins, they're very young, and so I'm not getting a lot of sleep at that stage. But he says, I don't care, trade has just collapsed, and we need to make sure that it's not anti-dumping that was causing the trade collapse. It could have been protectionism, right? That could have been the story. We didn't know what the story was at the time because we weren't really effectively, accurately monitoring these kinds of things. The multilateral institutions weren't doing it yet. The WTO was doing very little in this space at that time. This is when they first started doing so. In fact, at that stage, they weren't even tracking 6-digit HS codes of measures being imposed. This was amazing, right? All they would do is report, this is what our members tell us they're doing, and they put anti-dumping on hot-rolled steel. You'd be like, well, how do I match that to something? Don't know, right? It was amazing how little information that we had. So at that stage, Bernard calls, and I said, okay, so we updated it, put out a little monitoring report. This is even he didn't actually only call me. He also called Simon Evenet, right? Global Trade Alert, St. Gallen. And this was the commencement of the Global Trade Alert at that point in time as well, sort of summer, fall of 2008, early 2009. So we update that. And then Bernard calls every quarter. He's like, yeah, well, that we got to write something for the G20, or the board wants this. Bob Zellick was the president of the World Bank at this time, and Bob knows a lot about trade. So he was very, very interested in what was happening during this space. So anyway, updated this thing every quarter, right? And this was a lot of work for somebody who was also trying to raise twins and be a professor and all the sort of things that I was supposed to be doing in my real job. But luckily, the World Bank then made me an offer, and that's when I came down here. And so I came to the bank in the fall of 2009 and started my sort of career here. We kept on tracking and monitoring and trade policy and that kind of stuff throughout the kind of recovery from the crisis. Rebranding, though, we built out the database. It was no longer just, initially it was the global anti-dumping database, but we added countervailing measures, countervailing duties, and safeguards, and made it the temporary trade barriers database, right? So branding is important. Also temporary trade barriers to try to remind governments that they were supposed to remove these things after a period of time as well. They were supposed to be temporary, so a little nudge. In any case, that's what we did. We did that for a couple of years. And then the sort of financial crisis subsides, things kind of go back to normal. Okay. That's 2010, 11. In a year in there too, as I actually went to the White House and did the Council of Economic Advisors job and sort of had an experience in government and can kind of see how important this stuff is as well. Now we roll around, and also fabulous papers are being published during this time, not by me, but by Key and Alessandro and Marcelo, the kind of initial ad valorem equivalent estimates using the sort of version 1.0 or 0.5 or something of the NTMs data, right, which is an incredibly valuable contribution in this research space. Your 2008-9 work and Restat and EJ there, follow-up work during the global financial crisis. Then 2014, Ralph calls it, late 2014, early 2015. Ralph calls. He didn't call me. At this point, Aditya Matu is the research manager at the bank, and I'm here. And so I don't remember. You can tell the story of the origins. I was not there for the origins of the bank, the exact origins of the bank UNCTAD pairing, but they were at that time, and Ralph will explain this later, redoing the NTM's database sort of kind of from scratch. And you saw the table of the measures in Lucas's presentation earlier. But they were going to systematically do this, and they kind of described the methodology, which is something, and I'm sorry if I'm stealing your thunder here, but it was basically like going to every country, reading every single page of that country's regulations, mapping it to those codes, and then figuring out what the HS product codes are for each of those things, and creating a database. But for doing this for every country of the world. Right, and they sort of started off an early version of the project, but then the bank comes in and says, well, that's very interesting what you're doing there. But, the big countries that are using these NTMs, none of them are covered by what it is that you guys are doing. So why aren't you doing that? And I think your answer to that was something like, this costs a lot of money. And so the bank said something like, we have money, or we can get access to money. So that's basically the role that I played, was trying to come up with the money. And then hiring of the consultants, but all of the hard work was actually being done in Geneva by Ralph and his team. So, we were kind of partners in the project in some sense, but really should not be overstated just how important a role, because all of the sort of the genesis of the project and all of them making it actually happen was Ralph's team in Geneva. So the idea was to kind of scale that, and Ralph will talk about how many countries and how much coverage there would be. But it's not only the bank that was interestingly interested in this, obviously at the time, but there were some rich countries as well that were willing to fund the work. And the reason why, and so again, this is 2014, 13, 14 or so, governments like Japan, especially the Japanese government, was super interested in this and was kind of curious as to why. And their argument was, look, we're doing this TPP negotiation thing with the United States right now. This is probably the biggest trade thing that we've ever done. Most of the gains from trade that are going to come out of this thing and the distributional impacts and all the kind of stuff that we would care about as economists are not going to come through reductions in tariffs. Tariffs are already really low between, bilaterally and so if we're going to come up with a case to be made about why this is worthwhile to do and then how to think about the impacts, we really need to understand all the non-tariff measure aspects as well. And so it was, rich countries thinking they weren't funding it because they were worried about sub-Saharan Africa or anything like that. They were very much interested in their own self-interests. And they gave us, I hope, because I think I left before the checks were actually cashed, but I think they hopefully gave us a lot of money to actually pull off the project in terms of the work that ultimately needed to get done. So that was interesting, not just the TPP, but also then the US-EU and TTIP negotiations. It was going to be a lot of non-tariff measures as well. So I agreed to do this. I'm not sure why. It was a lot of management stuff, and as I came to learn over my career, if there's one thing I'm really bad at, it's management. Not sure what I'm good at. I've tried every other job, right, ranging from running regressions to just purely building Excel spreadsheets of data to podcasting, right? And so I've tried everything else. Not sure what I'm good at, but I know what I'm not good at, and that's management. So My payoff was ultimately going to be, Key said, if you go off and collect all this data, I'll write a paper with you someday using the data. So go off and collect all the data, and then maybe Alessandro will join us as well. So I was like, oh, I get to write a paper with Key. I mean, everybody dreams about something like that, and all of you here today have written papers with Key. I see you on the program, so you know what it's like. In any case, that was the promise to me, and she would have followed through, but then I left. So it was my own fault. I ended up leaving the bank, and it was because the Peterson Institute called. And so that was late 2015. I showed up at Peterson in April of 2016, and then Donald Trump came along, and I forgot about non-tariff measures because we had tariff measures that I had to think about for a very long period of time. So we've got tariffs with Trump. We've got a podcast that now I have to deal with. We've got the U.S.-China trade war, tech war, and then we've got the pandemic and supply chain disruptions. Export controls are now back. I forget which one are export controls in P. Okay, great. And now we've got industrial policy, which I wrote this down. It's L for subsidies. Is that L? And rules of origin, local content stuff is O, right? So in any case, the United States, what I'm going to talk about next, it's back, right? It's all about, well, it's everything. It's both tariff measures. All the tariffs are still there. The trade war tariff stuff is still there. But it's now industrial policy and export controls. And so if I originally came to the bank in 2009, both for the reason of the global financial crisis, but also admittedly at that stage, trade policy for rich countries was just super boring. There was nothing going on, in the United States or Europe or anything like that. Now, unfortunately, it's exciting again, but a lot of it is coming through non-tariff measures. In any case, so that's my backstory. Now, if you'll let me talk for maybe 15 minutes about research. Am I okay on time, or have I already gone on for too long? Let me make sure.
You're good.
Okay. So you want to start again at 1:15? So I got about 10 minutes?
What is the time?
1 o'clock?
It's 1 o'clock sharp.
Yeah? Okay. All right. I'll get through this. I'll get through this very quickly. Okay. How many of you have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act? Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So this is the United States and what happened here. Okay. So what's the problem here? And so obviously climate change is the problem, right? And so we think about the United States. This is going to be a analysis very much focused on just what's happened in the United States. Climate change, huge problem. In the United States, nearly 40% of our carbon emissions come from transportation. 58% of that is personal vehicles, 25% is commercial trucks, buses, things like that, right? So if we want to make a dent into American emissions to try to meet the Paris climate targets, we've got to do something about the transportation sector. And the challenge was that American consumers were just not switching to electric vehicles quickly enough. And so this is a chart where I plot EVs as a share. So new vehicles entering the market each year, what share of those are electric relative to internal combustion engine? And what you can see is the United States is severely lagging both Europe and China. Even by the end of last year, we're still maybe 8%. 2021, it was only 5% of new U.S. vehicles entering the market were electric. Much higher rates for China and Europe. And it's not as if, so how many of you have heard of Tesla? This Elon Musk guy, he's pretty low key, he doesn't get out much. Yeah. So it's not that the United States is exporting Teslas to the world and we're not consuming them, we're not buying them here in the United States because the rest of the world is taking these things up. No. This is U.S. exports. So this is 12-month trailing sums. This is U.S. exports of EVs to the world. In value terms, that's the top chart. And in volume terms, that's the bottom chart. And we're severely lagging both China and Europe here as well, right? So, okay, so the United States needs to do something. Why aren't American consumers doing this? Well, you live here, many of you, or you have lived here. This is a giant country. If you want to get anywhere, public transportation is terrible. You need to have a car, and Americans like really big cars, and that requires really big batteries or super expensive batteries. And so the technology was tricky. We don't have a lot of charging infrastructure in place yet. So Americans have what's called range anxiety. Second, we have a very large and politically important internal combustion engine vehicle industry in the United States, a legacy. This is GM, Ford, Chrysler, Stellantis, with hundreds of thousands of jobs in swing states, Michigan, Ohio, Georgia, right? And the idea is, as we switch over to electric vehicles, the Teslas of the world are not setting themselves up in Detroit, right, at the same plant as an engine plant for General Motors that might be phased out is going in, right? The Tesla stuff is in California or battery plants in Nevada. So there's a big concern about lost jobs, and we're still recovering, quote unquote, at least psychologically in the United States, from the China shock, right? So the idea of another massive shock to manufacturing would be devastating. And then the third argument for when the United States is beginning to think about policy in this space is the existing supply chain for the critical inputs that go into electric vehicles. So the batteries are things like critical minerals and the battery components, so the anodes and cathodes and that kind of stuff, are completely dominated by China. And the U.S. and China, you also might not have heard about it, but not really getting along at the moment, right? And so there's the concern that China might either exercise its market power, right, for economic purposes, to preference its firms relative to downstream firms in the rest of the world, or potentially weaponize these products, much like what we saw with Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, and things like natural gas and oil. Okay, so the result of all those concerns is you get this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act passed last summer. And the electric vehicle provisions are just one piece of it. It's sort of the headline of it. There's a lot of other stuff in there as well for wind, solar, carbon capture, clean hydrogen, all that kind of stuff. But we'll focus on the electric vehicle story because that's what dominated the headlines. So we've got these consumer tax credits. So it's a consumption subsidy. And it's essentially, if you go out and buy a car, we had these things before, right? In the United States, you get a $7,500 tax credit from the federal government. We had these sorts of subsidies before, but they had been phased out for some of the major manufacturers. Tesla, GM, you only got this under there was a 2009 legislation during the financial crisis where these were introduced initially, but manufacturers only got access to them for the first 200,000 units that they sold in the United States. The idea is we'll give them help until they get the scale, and then they shouldn't need help anymore. But what that meant was that Tesla and GM effectively were no longer receiving. If you wanted to get one of those types of vehicles, you weren't going to get a tax credit. So you need to have something to switch Americans over from ICE vehicles to EVs, consumer tax credits. Additional criteria to try to convince automakers to build out not just the fancy high-end Porsches and Teslas and things like that, but vehicles for the mass market. Initially, the legislation had a price cap, so regular cars couldn't be priced higher than $55,000, SUVs, trucks higher than $80,000, and an income cap. So adjusted gross income for an individual couldn't be higher than $150,000 a year. For households, $300,000. So the idea is let's try to convince the auto companies to start making models for the mass market to get as many people into electric vehicles as quickly as possible to reduce tailpipe emissions. But so in addition to that, they transform these consumer tax credits into industrial policy in two important ways. So the first is they say under this law, in order to get access to this tax credit, the vehicle has to be assembled in North America. So now all of a sudden, an electric vehicle that was coming in from South Korea, which you've seen the Hyundai Ioniq 5 or whatever, Americans loved it, all of a sudden no longer eligible for the tax credit because it was not assembled in North America. It was being put together at their plant in South Korea. The Volkswagen ID4, they're ultimately going to be making this thing in Tennessee, but their plant's not at scale yet, so all the ones coming across the Atlantic from Germany no longer eligible. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second is over the next couple of years, in order to get access to the tax credit, the critical inputs for the batteries, critical minerals, and the battery components can't be sourced from China. They don't all have to be sourced here in the United States or in North America. Some of this stuff can come from free trade agreement partners. But in order to get the tax credit, less and less of the content can be coming from China. Okay, so what happens? first, the South Korean trade minister was the first to really complain about this, but eventually Europe decides to start complaining as well, and it culminates in early December when French President Emmanuel Macron comes to Washington and says the Inflation Reduction Act it risks fragmenting the West. Right? And this is kind of amazing because at the same time you've got Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the United States, hugely supportive of Europe's efforts to sort of deal with this crisis along various dimensions, including providing military support, including provided a lot of actual energy exports and things like that last year. But still, Macron and other European leaders very upset by this. And the Biden administration, the president himself says, sort of, oops, this legislation was very complicated and we didn't really mean to exclude our friends and allies, Europe, so we'll tweak it. Okay, well, how will they tweak it? Right, and this goes to building these databases. You have to understand domestic procedures about how these laws get written, how the regulations get implemented, and things like that. They can't just rewrite the law because in the United States that involves Congress, and now Congress has we had the midterm elections in November, and so the Republicans have taken over the House. There's no way you're going to reform the law, but what they can do is they can, through implementing regulations, make changes to the margin here or there. So what happens is in December. At the end of December, the Treasury Department, which is in charge of writing these implementing regulations, says that actually there's a separate track in the Inflation Reduction Act. All the things that we were talking about, the price cap, income cap, sourcing requirements, all that kind of stuff, are tax credits available through something called Section 30D. Well, turns out there's this completely other separate section of the Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits available for commercial vehicles. Now, normally you think of commercial vehicles, that's big trucks, maybe the vans, the Amazon delivers packages, things like that. But Treasury says a commercial vehicle could also be a car, provided that you lease it. How many of you know what leasing a vehicle is? If you're not American, this may be a completely weird concept to you. But in the United States, right, you can't go to a car dealership and lease it, right? You basically take 2 years, you give them a couple of $100s or whatever every month, and then after those 2 years, you have nothing. You give the car back to them. You basically rented the car for kind of a long-term contract. So, but Treasury says, well, that's one way that we can actually get around that. Okay, and then they say things like, well, in March they define, we'll be creative in how we define free trade agreement partners for satisfying these other criteria as well. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, what does this mean for trade flows? So if things had strictly been implemented, we would have expected IRA goes into effect on August 16th, 2022. All of a sudden, a vehicle that's being assembled in Europe or South Korea no longer eligible for the tax credit starting in August. We would have expected a massive decline, right, of imports coming in. If you want to think about electric vehicles as being fertilizer, right? This is basically the Devaki story. We would have expected to see that, but you don't see it, right? Imports from both Europe and Korea continue to grow. So that's puzzling. Why is that? Well, it turns out that these criteria were so restrictive that no vehicles qualified for them, essentially. Only 10 vehicles qualified for them, right? So even, there just weren't vehicles assembled in America that you could get access to these tax credits for. So imports really weren't put at a disadvantage because no vehicles qualified for the tax credit for the first couple of months. Okay, but then second, starting the 1st of December, after that December 29th Treasury announcement, provided you lease a vehicle, you can get access to this tax credit through a completely separate channel. Okay, so what's the evidence there? So there's a couple of random companies, Edmunds, that collect data on leasing. And so I called up the people that collect this data and said, hey, I run a podcast. Don't you want to be famous and be on my podcast? And they said, sure. So I have them on the podcast. And then I say, hey, can you send me your data? Because I also run regressions. So they sent me the data, and I got to put it into this fancy chart. And you can see it. It's unbelievable, right? So in December, so before the announcement, it was only 9.7% of electric vehicles were being leased at that moment in time. But over the next couple of months, and now it's up to like 37%, right? And I'll have a separate piece out in a couple of weeks, breaking it out by trading partner. And you can understand why countries were so upset. South Korea especially, I think they were leasing something like 2% before the December announcement, and now they're up to 40% or something like this. It's endogenous, right? They thought, oh, leasing, it's not going to help us. This isn't going to be the answer. You create the right incentives. If there's money to be made there, markets work, right? And so that's effectively what we're seeing. So interestingly, this is a creative way that they seem to at least temporarily have solved this problem. Now, what's super interesting about this is none of those other criteria that I talked about at the beginning apply under the separate track. So if Americans all start switching to leasing their electric vehicles because they want access to this tax credit and they want to get European ones or South Korean ones that aren't otherwise eligible, the problem is none of those other constraints bind. So the constraint on price, now you can get the tax credit for a $150,000 Porsche, right? The sourcing of battery inputs from China doesn't bind. So the way I like to think about this is Donald Trump could lease $500,000 Rolls Royce that was assembled personally by Xi Jinping in China, right? And it would qualify for a tax credit under this Section 45W thing. Like none of those other constraints apply. And Congress had written those other constraints because they were really trying to mess around with the incentives to move the supply chain out of China, get access to lower income, American consumers and things like, anyway. So we'll see. Maybe this is not a long run solution, but that's where we are. Just a reminder, we're all about non-tariff measures, but tariffs kind of impact things too. So there were a lot of European complaints, and many of them that you work at a think tank and governments come and yell at you because they think you somehow have a voice with the American government. So a lot of European policymakers come and yell at me in the fall. And I want to remind them that you have a 10% tariff on electric vehicles. And to an economist, import tariff is the equivalent to a consumption tax and a production subsidy. So you kind of have the equivalent of a local production subsidy already in place yourselves, Europe. So, you're not being all that truthfulnessy in terms of your own concerns. And then finally, you've got these massive tariff preferences to South Korea and Japan through your free trade agreements. We have very small tariff preferences. NAFTA's 2.5%. And the main preference that Europe is enjoying is relative to China in the U.S. market because we still have the trade war tariffs on electric vehicles that might otherwise be coming in from China. So we're not importing Teslas from China, unlike Europe. So here's the European import data for electric vehicles. Yes, Europe used to import Teslas from the United States, and I think Europe still thinks, because they see a lot of Teslas on the road, that we're buying all of these Teslas from the United States. No, you used to. And then Tesla's plant in China got going, the Gigafactory in Shanghai, and now you're buying all of your Teslas from China, right? So imports from the United States have basically disappeared, and they're now importing a lot of electric vehicles from China. And then this is just the last slide. Even if the electric vehicle saga is now been over between the US and Europe, the European other problems with IRA remain. There are all these other subsidies to clean energy in the United States. And the main concern, I think, from the European perspective, and for those interested in this sort of economically efficient carbon pricing sort of perspective, is what the United States is doing works against that, right? We're going to be we're subsidizing clean energy. That's going to reduce the overall price of energy in the United States at the same time that other countries are going to be raising energy prices through carbon taxes, phasing out of allowances for emissions trading, things like that, creating these competitiveness asymmetries there that are going to lead to continued concerns. The end. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do I have to take any questions, or can I just leave, Keith?
No, there may be questions. I can tell you one thing that you can do, and that's talking in a nice and very lively way about economic rationale and trade, and present it in an appealing way. So I think that's very important, because we as economists have also the duty to inform policymakers, and it's a way how we present our results. And I think that you are really doing a great job here. Are there any questions, comments? Please, yes?
I did not cluster my standard errors, or deal with autocorrelation concerns.
Nothing that sophisticated. Thanks so much for the presentation. I actually listened to your podcast on this, so I really enjoyed it. I guess I have two questions. One is, there was also the provision about the cars being from an FTA country. I don't know if you've looked at that or analyzed that, or if we have some clarity on what countries those actually include, because I think that it was a little bit confusing on which countries qualify. And my second question is, so in some of our country work, we've been advising the governments that local content requirements on EVs are not the way to go. So this did not help our case. But one of the things that we've tried to do for Indonesia and the Philippines were to try to look at these local content requirements, but also other non-tariff measures that are affecting EV imports, and try to see if they are actually helping the infant industry develop in this space. So I just wanted to sort of hear from you, maybe what, if you've thought about lower income countries doing the same thing, and what your thoughts would be in terms of our policy advice on that. Thanks.
Yep. So I think your policy advice is the right one. And this is where the United States, I think, has lost credibility on this issue. This is, I think, to my knowledge and talking with other experts in this area, this is really the first time the United States has done local content requirements. And we've filed WTO disputes against other countries for their local content requirements, including on green energy products. So this is incredibly hypocritical in some sense. Will the United States be able to so why is the United States doing it? I think its argument is sort of what I laid out at the beginning. There's a jobs component to it. It's not clear to me that that's going to help the transition. I think the workers that are going to lose their jobs in ICE plants in Michigan and Ohio are going to be equally upset if they lose their job to an EV plant that's now in Tennessee, compared to one if they'd lost it to an EV plant in Europe or South Korea. So we're not dealing with that problem, labor market adjustment problem, effectively on the U.S. side. The sourcing criteria that does seek to try to shift some of the supply chain out of China, I see there's some merit to that argument, because we're very worried about excessive concentration of certain supply chains. I think even independent of the U.S.-China tensions issue, it would still be of economic concern to me that we'd want to do something about. So that may be a second best or a third best reason to want to do that from the U.S. side, but that's not a good reason for other countries to do the same thing. So I think the policy advice that you're giving them is probably the right one. To your first question, so what the United States did, two things on free trade agreements. So on March 31st, they laid out what the criteria would be for trading partners to potentially satisfy a free trade agreement for the definition of getting access to the tax credits under Section 30D. So far, they've only signed one such agreement, and that's with Japan. Other countries, they're negotiating one with Europe right now. Other countries have said that they want one, and you can understand why, because if you get called this thing, then that gives an incentive for firms to set up a critical mineral, a lithium processing facility in your country, or a mine in your country, because it can get eligible for tax credits in the U.S. market, right? So it makes sense to do so. Indonesia has said they want to negotiate one. Philippines has said they want to negotiate one. The UK has said they want to negotiate one. South Korea has said, actually, we want you to negotiate one both with Indonesia and Argentina. And the argument there, I've been told, is because the South Korean firms that are a big part of the battery supply chain, that's where they source from, and they want their stuff to also count, right? So this is fascinating to understand the complexities of these supply chains. But so far, only Japan has signed one of these agreements, and you can't just automatically qualify. You're going to have to negotiate with the U.S. Trade Representative's office, ultimately, to get green-lighted on something like this. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't have question. I just want to thank Chad, and you guys understand why I invite him to be the keynote speaker. How entertaining this is. I mean, not every day that you can laugh and learn something at the same time. Thank you so much, Chad. And I did remember my promise to you that you're going to write a paper. I have a broad idea about, using whatever terms of trade model to try to understand how countries may large countries may use their market power to impose NTM on their trading partners in order to extract some terms of trade gains. So
I'll send you the,
all of you are my witness. I promise that I'll write this paper with Chad.
I'll send you the leasing data, and you can throw that in the model then too. Thank you, Keith.
Okay, I think these were perfect closing remarks. Thanks a lot, Chad.